work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. In case you've never heard of us, we are a group of attorneys who serve Maryland's farming community. We provide legal education and outreach throughout the state. So I've provided our website here. I encourage you to check out all of our legal resources. I am an attorney, but I am here today to simply provide education. If you need individual legal advice, please consult your attorney. All right, so let's start with our learning objectives for today. I want you to be able to understand some of the legal and practical risks associated with having farm labor. In order to do that, we're going to talk about employment laws that apply to Maryland's farms, and we're going to break them down into the various categories that come about when you're hiring someone on your farm. So we'll start with hiring. We'll talk about classifying workers, and I'll explain to you why that's an important part of this process. We'll move on to paying and protecting your workers, and although we hope it doesn't have to happen, we'll also talk about termination or firing your workers. All right, so let's start off with hiring. The first step in hiring is often crafting a well-done job description. A job description, it's important to spend some time on it. It's going to help you attract qualified candidates for the job. Legally, it's important to include certain things in your job description. So in addition to a clear and concise description of the job itself, you're going to want to list essential functions of the job. So you're going to want to include some specifics about what task this worker is going to have to do, if they need to lift a certain amount of weight regularly or occasionally while doing the job, if they're going to have to work in certain weather conditions, are they going to have to be outside in adverse weather conditions, and importantly, if they need certain licenses, if they're going to have to operate certain types of equipment. You're going to want to put all of that in the job description. I've provided a link here for you to give you some examples of well-crafted job descriptions. The time you spend on this is not going to be time wasted. It's going to help you communicate expectations to those folks that are reviewing that description. If someone is misled at the beginning of the recruitment process, it could potentially lead to them leaving the job soon after they start on the farm, and that's going to cost you time and money. Also, think about that job description as a tool that you can use later on in the process. So you can use it during the interview, and then you can also use it later on when you're doing a performance review of that employee. A job application is also something that you might want to consider. So here's a few things to include in a job application if you want to create one of those for the positions on your farm. Personal and background information, basic things like full name, legal name, you want to make sure they include address, past places of work. You might want to ask them for some references. And if you do ask them for references, take the time to give those folks a call and verify those references. Ask them some simple questions. What was their relationship to the candidate? When did they work for you? Why did they leave your employment? Another thing to consider is having the employee sign that job application, and just so that it's abundantly clear that anything listed in that job application is true and accurate. Some federal non-discrimination laws to be aware of during the hiring process. As a general rule, discrimination of any kind is prohibited in the workplace. That includes hiring. So I think sometimes folks aren't necessarily thinking about those discrimination issues at the very early stages of the labor process, but they should be, because hiring is included and folks are protected during that process as well. So we have the laws that I've listed here, the Americans with Disabilities Act, quite a few age discrimination and employment acts. We've got a lot of different federal laws that make up this network of protection for folks when they're looking for employment. And I gave you the link there so you can take a look at those in a little bit more detail. Background checks. That's another thing that folks sometimes want to include in the hiring process, just as a way to give you some more information about those folks as they come on board. You can do this simply by, plugging the person's name into a search engine like Google and seeing what comes up. In Maryland, a good thing to utilize is the Maryland Judiciary Case Search. This is a free public site, and it's going to list criminal and civil causes of action that the person has been involved with, and give you a certain amount of information. And then, social media, see if the person has a Facebook, Twitter, and see if anything, unusual pops up in those searches. And, all that information, if, that's out there, that's public information. But make sure anytime you're using background information, you still have to keep those federal laws in mind and not make actions based on discriminatory reasons. So screening and interviewing applicants. So you've got that job description, you have some folks interested, and it's time to bring folks in for the interview. Important to come up with some questions, sort of a framework for how you want to analyze these different folks that are coming in the door. Come up with some questions to help keep you on track and to help make sure that you don't inadvertently ask any questions that you're not permitted to ask. And I'll give you some examples of how some seemingly innocent questions could potentially get an employer into that discriminatory area that they certainly don't want to be anywhere near. Certain questions to avoid. So I'll get to that in a second. Questions to ask. We've all been to job interviews. Tell me about yourself. What aspects of the job appeal to you? What makes you a good candidate? Where do you see yourself in the future? Feel free to ask the applicant about things they've listed on that job application if you've gone ahead and crafted one of those. Can you perform the essential functions outlined in the job description? That's a really important one, and that is why it's important to put those essential job functions in that job description. So because you've put it right there in the description, you've already listed the important things that this person needs to be able to do in order to perform well at this job, that's the best way to ask about it in an interview. Can you perform those essential functions? And then, what questions do you have for me? Okay, let's play a little round of can you ask that in a job interview? This is just kind of a fun way to make sure that you understand those different areas that we need to be careful about while asking job interview questions. So, when did you graduate from high school? Do you think you can ask that question? Sounds like a pretty innocent question, right? You shouldn't ask that question because it can be a way to actually try to figure out how old someone is. Typically it's pretty easy math to figure out how old someone generally is by when they graduated high school. So try to avoid that question, even though it seems like a pretty innocent one, because you wouldn't want to be accused of discriminating based on age. Are you eligible to work in the United States? What do we think about that one? Yes, that's a perfectly fine question to ask. That's the way you should ask it. Make sure you don't deviate too far from that one. How about, are you a U.S. citizen? Don't want to ask that one because there are protections to avoid discrimination based on nationality. So instead of asking, are you a U.S. citizen, ask the person, are they eligible to work in the United States? You can see it's two, might come off as slightly different, but actually there's an important difference there that you're going to want to avoid. Are you married? Do you have children? Do we want to ask those questions? Those are definitely questions I've been asked in job interviews before. No, you should not be asking those questions. Definitely want to try to avoid those issues. Why are people asking those questions? They're often asking those questions because they want to know, is this worker going to have the time to devote to the job, right? That's why you'd be asking that question. So instead of beating around the bush and asking, how many kids do you have? Are you married? Ask, do you have any commitments that would prevent you from working the shifts that are outlined in the job description? So much more clear way to ask it in a way that you can ask it that hopefully will keep you out of hot water. All right, so everything's going well. The applicant has accepted the job. In a non-COVID world, you've maybe had a handshake. Consider putting the terms of that offer in writing. Doesn't have to be anything too formal. You can put it in a letter or an email. It's, it's a best practice just to try to avoid any future misunderstandings about the terms of the job. So, a simple, just a confirmation of the offer and the acceptance that happened today, in the farm office, that this is going to be your wage rate, this is going to be your work activity, and, and this is what we're offering you in terms of wages and benefits. And then, notifying the other applicants that the job has been filled, just good courtesy and another best practice. One thing that I wanted to make sure to mention to you is an I-9 form, which sounds like a sort of a technical government form that might not necessarily seem that important, but actually it's an important form because it protects the employers. So, employers are required to verify an employee's identity and eligibility to work in the United States using that I-9 form. So I'm sure many of you have probably had to fill these out before when you've started in different jobs. You have to show your passport, other forms of identification, and the employer signs off that you have shown them that evidence. Having those forms filled out properly and retaining those forms is really the protection for the employer that they're not hiring somebody who's ineligible to work in the United States. So it's an important practice, because it's going to be your defense if there was ever a claim that you knowingly employed someone who wasn't eligible to work in the United States. All right. So, moving on to classifying. Important to classify the workers on your farm. It might sound like one more extra thing to do. Why do I need to think about this? But there's a lot of different workers that work on farms. We've got migrant workers, seasonal workers, in some cases H-2A visa workers, interns, family members, very common to have on farms. And all of these different categories of workers there's different legal obligations for these different folks. Oftentimes they're working side by side, maybe, on very similar things on the farm, but they have different legal protections and employers have different legal responsibilities. So, think about the factors if you're having trouble classifying some of your workers. What do these workers do? Are they doing farm work? When we move on to talk about paying and protecting of workers, it'll become clear why it's important to think about whether these folks are doing farm work. If they're doing non-farm work on a farm, that's going to be a different classification, and it's going to be important for how they're treated, how they must be treated, how they must be paid. How do these workers do it? So are they doing it independently, or are they doing it with your oversight and control? And then what are the expectations based on the classification? So one question that we get a lot at the Agriculture Law Education Initiative, something that comes up again and again, is employees versus independent contractors. Common to find both of these folks on farms, and misclassification of a worker as typically misclassifying someone who is actually an employee as an independent contractor can have some pretty serious legal and financial consequences. I will give you the link here for the IRS guidance page, which will go into more depth on this topic. But in general, employees are typically folks that are paid hourly or by salary or on a piece rate basis. The employer is exerting a lot of control over an employee. So, the boss is telling you how to get the job done, when you need to report to work. The boss is providing you tools to do that job. And you're typically just working for one employer. That's an employee versus an independent contractor who's often paid on a project-by-project basis. They're going to decide the manner and the means by which they get the job done. They're often going to bring their own tools and equipment, and they often offer this service to many different clients, right? So that's kind of the breakdown there. If you've got any questions about that or you think you might be misclassifying someone, important to seek some legal counsel about that. You would definitely want to get that one straightened out as soon as possible. Other workers that we get a lot of questions about are interns, and we've got interns and apprentices here that I'll go over. So interns can be a great hiring option for employers. There's a lot of young people who are interested in agriculture, want to get on farms and learn more about it, and that's a wonderful thing. Important to not treat those folks any differently than regular workers unless they meet the U.S. Department of Labor's test for what is an intern and what is an employee. It's a 7-factor test. It's challenging for that test to be met in the farm context. So if you've got interns, that's great. If you want to pay them any less or treat them any less well than you would any other worker, I would take some pause on that and make sure that you have applied this test, sought some legal advice, and really thought about whether or not this person can be treated less well than a regular worker. Typically, the interns that meet that test and that can be paid less or treated less well than a regular worker, there's a classroom component of the internship. The interns are really a bit of a nuisance on the work site. It's really more of a learning environment. So an intern who calls himself an intern but is doing the work of any other farm worker, that's probably going to be a worker. So be careful on that. And same thing with apprentices. There's legal definitions of what is and what is not an apprentice. Volunteers. Volunteers, we get a lot of questions about, and volunteers are also can be a great thing. Important to think about the fact that you can have volunteers on a nonprofit farm, unpaid volunteers, legally on a nonprofit farm, and there are some nonprofit farms out there for educational purposes, and that's just fine. Most farms are for-profit businesses, and individuals cannot waive their right to receive minimum wage. So even if I really want to learn about organic vegetable production and I want to volunteer my time and I want to go out on that farm and I don't need to be paid anything because I'm just going to be paid in my own personal satisfaction, that's going to create a problem for the employer, because if it's a for-profit business, you cannot have unpaid volunteers. I know that that's not what some folks want to hear, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. Volunteers are also commonly found, not all the time, but sometimes found on farms with community-supported agriculture structures in place. So members of a CSA, they might come on the farm to pick their own share each week. Sometimes that's an option. In other cases, CSA farms have structured things so that the price of the share itself can be reduced because of volunteer activities from the member. These are tricky areas, especially, assuming we're dealing with a CSA that's a for-profit business here. So again, I would think about control. So how are these members coming onto the farm? Are they coming on, based on their own schedules? Are you providing them any tools? A lot of those similar factors that played into when we were talking about classifying employees and independent contractors. But for that volunteer, would you need to pay an employee to do that work? So if you've got CSA members who are coming onto the farm and acting just like any other worker that you would have to pay, you need to take pause and probably seek some legal advice there on whether or not you've got an issue with your volunteer structure. Paying and protecting workers. This is probably the most complex part of this, so stay with me, but we'll get through it together. There's a lot of different layers involved with how you need to pay and protect folks on your farm. So we've got federal laws, and they set the baseline for things like wages and hours, health and safety protections. There's a lot of reporting, record-keeping requirements, those discrimination protections that we've already touched on. And then states are able to pass laws to have additional protections, higher wages, more health and safety protections. And here in the state of Maryland, we have our employment and labor laws. In some cases, they mirror the federal standards. In a lot of other cases, they set additional protections for workers. So when you're thinking about how do I need to pay and protect these people, you actually need to look at the federal, state, and sometimes your county level laws to answer that question. So payroll and record keeping, federal and state laws are going to regulate how often you have to pay folks. So in Maryland, you have to pay folks no less than every 2 weeks or semi-monthly. You've got to keep records. Wage records are broken down into payroll records and then timesheets. So payroll records have to be kept for 3 years, timesheets have to be kept for 2. And then obviously, you're going to have requirements for withholding taxes. The U.S. Department of Labor's website has a lot of information about that. And then in Maryland, it's the Department of Labor and Licensing Regulation. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then if you hire H-2A, migrant, or seasonal workers, you're going to have another layer of regulation that you're going to have to make sure you understand and are embracing on your farm. In Maryland, we also have an equal pay for equal works law. That's going to prohibit you from discriminating between your employees. So paying a wage to employees of one sex or gender at a different rate than other folks, and then providing less favorable employment opportunities based on sex or gender as well. So something to keep in mind, important. All right, the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, that is a very all-encompassing piece of federal labor law, and so it covers a lot of ground, talks about the maximum hours that folks can work in a work week, sets the national minimum wage, sets overtime standards, and covers child labor standards. There are certain categories of workers that are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. When we're talking about farms, most farms are going to be covered because employees engaged in agriculture are covered when they produce goods that are going to interstate commerce. So most farm goods are going to probably be traveling outside of state, so they'd be covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right, so I talked about that layering of different labor laws. It comes into play very clearly with minimum wage laws. So we've got a federal minimum wage, we've got a state minimum wage, in some states a higher minimum wage. So in Maryland we've got a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage, and then counties. So unless an exemption applies, and there are some exemptions for farm workers that I'll go through, you need to be paying the higher of the minimum wages. So whichever one's higher there, federal, state, or local, that's the one that you're going to need to make sure you pay. The hardest part about this is just keeping up with it all. So, making sure that you've checked and you know what the current minimum wage is. In Maryland, we're in a period right now where our minimum wage is increasing year by year. So it's just important to make sure you check it before the season starts and you start cutting those paychecks. So if you're in counties like Prince George's County or Montgomery County, make sure you understand your county's minimum wage and how your farm workers fit into that. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of these exemptions, and so try to stay with me. These are federal exemptions that are found in the Fair Labor Standards Act. They're also within Maryland law, and I'll point out a few that are Maryland specific. But this is a mirroring provision where Maryland adopted these exemptions that apply to farm workers. So, agricultural employees who are the immediate family member of their employer. So I made that word immediate bold for a purpose because we oftentimes have a lot of different types of family members working on farms. Make sure if you are taking advantage of this exemption and you don't want to pay that family member the minimum wage or overtime, that they meet that definition of an immediate family member. Those principally engaged on the range and the production of livestock, hand harvest laborers who commute daily from their permanent residence, that are paid on a piece rate basis, and that were engaged in agriculture fewer than 13 weeks during the preceding calendar year. I know these are kind of long. And then the next one is also for hand harvest laborers on a piece rate that are paid on a piece rate basis, and that's for folks that are under the age of 17, employed on the same farm as their parent. They have to be paid at least the same as the employees who are 17 years on the same farm. So for all of these folks, federal law and Maryland state law says that you don't need to pay them minimum wage. Most farm employers I hear from tell me, if I didn't pay people minimum wage, I wouldn't be able to find anyone to work on my farm. Of course I pay people minimum wage, but just want to be very clear and let you know about these exemptions that exist. Then there's an exemption called the 500-man day exemption. So this is really for small farms, and sometimes folks refer to this as a small farms exemption. It's worded in a bit of a complicated way, but hopefully this example that I've got here on the slide will help you understand it. So any farm employer who did not, during any calendar year of the preceding calendar year, use more than 500 man-days of agricultural labor is eligible to take advantage of this exemption and not pay their employees minimum wage or overtime. So the example there hopefully kind of fleshes that out for you. So if you've got 7 workers, if they're working 6 days a week for 13 weeks, you've gone over that 500 man day. So you're no longer considered a small farm. You don't fit within this exemption. If you've got 1 or 2 workers on your farm, this is probably an exemption that you could take advantage of. Important to remember that a man day is any day that an agricultural worker works for at least 1 hour. So even if someone works 1 hour, that's a man day. Another important point is that to fit within this exemption or any of these exemptions, the worker needs to be working in what is considered by the law, the federal law, to be primary or secondary agricultural labor. I've given you the link there so you can see those definitions. A lot of times it's very clear whether someone is providing primary or secondary agricultural labor. Sometimes it can get a little bit trickier. If you've got an agritourism operation, if you've got an on-farm market, if you've got folks on your farm who are doing things that are not traditionally farm-related work, you might want to take a pause, seek some legal advice, and make sure that if you're taking advantage of these exemptions that you're able to because the work being done actually fits within those definitions. All right, a few Maryland-specific ones. So this is another exemption to the minimum wage and overtime in Maryland. Folks that are engaged in canning, freezing, packing, or first processing of fruits and vegetables and horticultural commodities. And then this isn't really a minimum wage or overtime exemption, but I just wanted to point it out. Maryland also allows employers to pay folks under 18 years of age a wage equal to 85% of the state minimum wage. So that's oftentimes referred to as a youth minimum wage or a youth wage. All right, overtime. Little tricky because the federal law completely exempts agricultural workers. So there is no requirement in the Fair Labor Standards Act for farm workers to be paid overtime. However, some states have passed laws, and it's more and more states are doing this in the last few years, offering some limited protections for farm workers. So in Maryland, if you've got a farm worker who doesn't meet any of those exemptions that we just talked about, they are entitled to overtime if they work more than 60 hours a week. So Maryland is kind of the exception to the rule. We're now in a handful of states who are offering some overtime protections to workers who don't meet any of the other exemptions. Again, you got to make sure that the work fits within primary or secondary agriculture as defined by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Child labor laws. So there's a lot of different variations with the child labor laws. I'm going to give you a general overview, and then I gave you a link here so that you can look up specific circumstances. But generally speaking, minors can be employed outside of school hours so long as they are limited to farm work that's performed on a farm. Kids 16 years and younger are not allowed to perform work that's considered hazardous. So there's a lot of hazardous jobs on a farm, so the question, right, is what is considered hazardous labor that kids should not be performing on farms? Cleaning or operating power-driven machinery, manufacturing, working in a yard, pen, or stall occupied by a stud animal or a sow or with suckling pigs, working inside a silo or manure pit, and handling or applying certain hazardous agricultural chemicals. So important to think about if you've got kids working on the farm, when are they working on the farm, and the nitty-gritty of what they're actually working on. An important thing, want to keep that limited to non-hazardous tasks. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act. So that's the federal law, and it sets that baseline that farmers are required to take certain steps. We all know that farm work is hazardous, and however, employers still required to provide certain things and take certain steps to make sure that they reduce the likelihood of injury or death on the farm. So in Maryland, we've got the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health folks. That's MOSH. That's a division of the Maryland Department of Labor and Licensing Regulation, and so they're the folks that are going to set those standards in Maryland. So there are regulations requiring some pretty simple things, but just important to keep in mind, workers have to be provided with cool, clean drinking water, well-stocked hand washing and toilet facilities, safety measures for tractors and heavy machinery. So if you've got any questions about any of that, important to take a look at those regulations and make sure that your farm is meeting the requirements. The worker protection standards. So this is an important thing that I think hopefully most farmers are already complying with, especially if they are certified pesticide applicators. But the worker protection standard is a label that's going to be on the back of most pesticides. It's going to require certain handling, storage, and treatment of those pesticides, and it is a federal law that employers are aware of those labels, that they're following those precautions, and they've got certain steps that they have to take in order to protect the workers that are coming into contact with those pesticides. The responsibilities are going to vary depending on the worker, depending on the exposure that the worker's having with the pesticides, but important to make sure you understand it and follow them closely. So here's the three main categories of things that workers need to be protected from and things that employers need to do. So employers have obligations in the realm of informing workers, informing them about annual pesticide trainings, informing them of where pesticides have been applied, protecting them by making sure that early entry workers, all pesticide handlers and any early entry workers must be at least 18 years or older, so that harkens back to what we were just talking about with child labor. So folks have to be a certain age before they can be around these types of pesticides. And then mitigating, so there have to be, the employer is required to take certain responses if there is an exposure. So medical care has to be provided, there has to be decontamination supplies on hand, water, soap, single-use towels, and that type of thing. If anyone has any questions about that, I encourage them to talk to the Maryland Department of Agriculture about that, and there's trainings to make sure that you're up to date with what you need to be doing with the worker protection standards. Migrant and seasonal agriculture workers. So most farm workers are going to be seasonal, right? Most of the time you're going to know if a farmer is a migrant worker, but important to think about this law. This is a federal law that's going to create standards that are applicable to all seasonal workers. So if you've got seasonal workers, this is a law that's going to apply to you. There's going to be certain standards for wage records, housing, transportation. There's certain disclosures that you need to make. So that means you need to make sure that you've got the poster up in the break room that is going to inform the workers of their rights pursuant to this law. Important, if you're using farm labor contractors, to not turn a blind eye. Farmers who employ farm labor contractors can be held jointly liable for things that the farm labor contractors do in some situations. So you want to make sure you're aware of what the contractor is doing, the actions they're taking, and you only want to use licensed farm labor contractors. The H-2A visa program, that's our last category here of workers, and I've done a lot of work with H-2A employers in the state of Maryland. We have quite a few. It's a wonderful program for employers. They're able to hire folks who are great workers on the farm. Not a simple program to navigate. Definitely creates a lot of legal obligations on the part of the employers who participate in it. So it's going to allow you to hire folks from other countries to temporarily work in the United States, typically 10 months or less. You have to, in order to participate in it, you have to demonstrate that there are not enough U.S. workers who are able, willing, qualified to do the work in the United States. And you've got to provide your H-2A folks with housing. There's obligations for you to pay for their transportation to and from the United States. and there's a minimum work guarantee. We've created a record-keeping self-audit checklist that if you have H-2A employees, I encourage you to take a look at. There have been quite a few H-2A employer investigations going on within our state in the last couple of years, and so this self-audit document helps you to review your internal record keeping and make sure that you're keeping the records you need to keep. We've gotten a lot of questions about this in the last year, and so I'll go over the general policy and not talk about anything COVID specific. But in Maryland, we do have a fairly new sick leave law. So there is required sick leave for most employees now within the state of Maryland. However, there is an exemption for employees working in the agricultural sector or on an agricultural operation. So if your employees meet that definition, this law is not going to require you to provide sick leave. However, there's a lot of good reasons to provide sick leave, so I think that's an internal decision you're going to have to make. Obviously, reducing the likelihood of sick workers spreading illness is an important thing. It's an important consideration employers need to decide whether or not they, even if they don't have to legally offer sick leave, whether they want to do so. A few more obligations I wanted to touch on. Workers' compensation. So Maryland treats farm employers a little bit differently for workers' compensation. There's a separate standard. So if you have at least 3 full-time employees or an annual payroll of at least $15,000 for full-time employees, then you are subject to the workers' compensation law. Even if you're not subject to it, you might want to consider buying into workers' compensation and having it as a protection for you, because it really is an employer protection. If an employee gets injured, it's going to pay the employee, but in most cases that's going to be the exclusive remedy for the employee's claim for that workplace injury. So make sure you understand workers' compensation, understand how it plays out in terms of protecting the employer in case that a worker got hurt. Unemployment insurance. Again, I wanted to mention this because this is another specialized little standard in Maryland law. So typically everybody's covered by unemployment insurance. However, farmers get a little bit special treatment. So a farm employer must participate if they pay wages of at least $20,000 during any calendar quarter of the current or preceding year to employees for agricultural work, or if they employ at least 10 individuals in a period of 20 weeks in the current or preceding year. So that's when you have to make sure that you are participating in the unemployment insurance program. Firing. So let's talk a little bit about firing. Good news is that Maryland is an at-will employment state. So what does that mean? Anybody know what that means? Means you can do whatever you want, right? Almost. It does mean that you can terminate someone for any time for really no reason at all. You don't need a reason to terminate an employee in Maryland unless you have an employment contract by which you have offered them something in addition to our baseline at-will status. So sometimes people form employment contracts and that then gives an employee some legal rights to have additional privileges that they wouldn't have necessarily had but for that contract. So think about an employment contract and whether it's worth it for you to have an employment contract because they need to be worded carefully. Same thing with employee handbooks. Oftentimes if you see employee handbooks in Maryland, the first thing on that employee handbook will say, this is not doing anything to disrupt at-will employment status. You're still an at-will employee, because employers want to be very careful that they don't do anything to bargain away that at-will status, because it's really a benefit for the employer. You still cannot terminate someone for a discriminatory reason. So even though we're an at-will state, you still have to be careful for the reasons you're terminating someone. Another important thing that comes up a lot in a bunch of different categories here, and I've tried to outline them, is you cannot terminate someone in a retaliatory sense. And by that I mean, If someone files for workers' compensation, if someone is attempting to enforce their rights, whether that's rights to a certain wage or whether that's rights to a protection under one of the many federal laws that we've talked about today, you cannot terminate someone because they're trying to assert their rights for a safe and healthy workplace, or things like reporting for jury duty or fulfilling military service obligations. So be careful that you're firing someone for the right reason, and document why you're terminating that person. Keep your own records as to why you're doing that. Be careful when you are terminating someone. Sometimes things can get, it's not a very happy situation. Sometimes it can be a heated exchange. And the last thing that an employer wants to do is hand over a check or any extra money at all to an employee. But it is not a good idea to terminate someone and then not give them everything they're entitled to. So make sure they're provided all earned income and all accrued leave at the time of termination. There are provisions in the law that penalize the employer for not doing so. So much better to just give the employee what they're owed and end it at that. All right, so I just want to wrap things up. I've gone through a lot of different considerations that are involved in this process. It does take some careful considerations. You've got a lot of things you've got to balance as the employer. You have to make sure that the employee's rights are being respected and that you're providing everything that you're legally obligated to provide. Failing to do so can have some really serious financial consequences. So you do not want to be on the wrong side of some of these federal or state labor laws. They've got increased damages provisions, and employers can really end up in some trouble. Important to consult qualified legal, accounting, and insurance folks. That's kind of the trifecta of professionals that at the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, we're always encouraging people to give those folks a call if you've got any questions. Make sure that those folks are familiar with farming operations and that they'll be able to help you make the best decisions. Wanted to let everybody know that this material is based on some grant funding. And with that, I'm all done. Provided my telephone number here, our email. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're always available to help you with your research or education needs. Thank you.